Hello. In this tutorial we're gonna build a voice that is built up around arpeggiated chords, and then we'll play around with it a bit, both in sound and in notes that get played. The result will sound something like this. Now there are a lot of ways that you can get arpeggiated chords. There are even modules that are specifically built for this purpose. So the method that I'll use here is just one approach, and it's the one that I usually use when I have a patch that is in a certain key with a chord progression, since it gives me more control over what's going on. Let's start by creating our chord sequence. I'm going to use a Phrase-Seq-16 by Impromptu. I'll set the length of the sequence to 8 steps by pressing the length button and clicking on the LED for the 8th step in the sequence. Now we can specify the notes that we want for each step on the keyboard below. For the first step, that's a C. For the second, an F, then a G, back to a C, onto an A, an E, G, and another E. In order for the sequence to move, we'll need a clock input, so I'll add the clocked by Impromptu. Set it to 90 beats per minute, which will define the master clock. And then how these 3 clock outputs are related to the master clock can be defined using the 3 knobs over here. So I'll set this first to trigger once for every 4 beats of the master clock, and I'll connect that to the clock input of the sequencer. I'll also connect the reset of the sequencer to that of the clock module, which will allow us to sync the different modules that will end up connected to the clock module. So now the sequencer is running, and if we click on the attach button so that the active step is also displayed on the module, you'll see which note is being sent to the CV output. Let's add a dIKTAT module by Bidoo, which will do the heavy lifting for us related to chords and music theory. Over here at the top, you specify which scale you want the module to work in, so you can change that to a D scale or an E and so on. And the second knob defines a type of scale, Ionian being a major scale. If you move that to Aeolian, you would get a minor scale. But this voice will be in C major, so let's put it back in Ionian. Over here on the input, you supply the root note of the chord you want the module to generate. And now the top 4 red outputs contain the root, the 3rd, the 5th and the 7th chord note of that chord. So we'll need those for the arpeggiation. Let's add a 4-to-1 switch by VCV and connect those 4 chord notes to it. We'll use another output of clocked to trigger the switch. I'll let that run at twice the rate and also connect it with the reset and sync the modules. And now the switch output will run through the chord notes. So let's already play that. I'll add a MixMasterJr by MindMeld and its AuxSpander. Connect the main output of the mixer to the audio output. Lower the output of the second channel a bit. To play the notes, I'll add the Dark Energy Oscillator module by Geodesics. Connect the switch to the 1 volt per octave input and the output to the mixer. And there you have the chord notes playing. Let's make them sound a bit better by adding a reverb. I'll use Plateau by Valley. It's going to be a send effect on the mixer, so let's connect aux A to the input, the output of Plateau back into the mixer. Since it's a send effect, don't send out any of the incoming signal and all of the reverb signal. We'll give it some modulation depth, close down the highs and the lows a bit. And now we can open up the reverb on that second channel. And if the only target was to play arpeggiated chords, then mission accomplished. But there is more, of course. Right now, the chords are always playing starting from the root note, which means that if the root note moves up, the whole chord moves up. But I want the notes to stay within the same octave instead, similar to what a pianist would do when playing chord progressions. In order to do this, I'll add a fence module by OrangeLine. You give this module a note on its input, and the module will then check if that note is within the range specified here at the top. And if it isn't, the module will add or remove 1 or more octaves from that note until it is within that range. The nice thing is that this module is polyphonic. If you provided multiple notes on the input, the same will be done for all of them on the output. So let's add a MergeSplit4 by Grande. We'll merge the 4 chord note outputs of dIKTAT send that into Fence, and connect the output back to the split. So while the notes over here on the input sometimes move outside of the C4 to B4 range, which corresponds to 0 volts to 1 volt, over here on the output, all notes are updated so that they do fall within that range. I will use that as input on our switch. Shift-click to remove the old connections and use the split output that went through Fence. And now you'll hear that the notes stay within that same octave. But since some of the notes have been moved and others haven't, there are some jumps in the pattern. The notes aren't always played from lowest to highest as you would expect in arpeggiated chords. We'll need to change the order of these notes so that they are sorted again from lowest to highest. There is of course a module that can do this. Let's add the Polyphonic Min-Max by Modula, which expects a polyphonic input, and then over here there is an ascending output and descending output, which will contain the voltages from the input sorted by their value. We'll connect that to the Fence output and use the ascending output as input for the split. And now the arpeggiated chords sound correct again, because the notes get sorted from low to high. I do think, however, that the dark energy module sounds better if the notes are a little bit higher. And we can achieve this by turning this knob, which will change the range on Fence. This sounds better, I think. I am going to do some additional modifications on the notes for this voice later, but first, let's work on the sound. A nice thing to do when playing chords is to play the root of those chords in the bass register. For this, I'll add a basal module by Vult, connect its 1 volt per octave input to the output of the sequencer to get that root note, set the volume of the first channel on the mixer a bit lower, and connect basal to the mixer. We'll let it play an octave lower, and open up mod 1 and mod 2 a bit. To fatten up the sound a little, I'll select the basal module, press Ctrl D to duplicate, also connect that to the sequencer, and send it to the right input on the mixer. Now we'll detune these two modules a little bit relative to each other, but only a very small amount. That sounds better. In order to make that bass sound change over time, I'll add an Oct module by Instruo to get a set of LFOs, turn down the rate on the module, and then connect 4 of the Oct outputs to the CV inputs of the basal modules. Open up the modulation amount for each of these. And now there's a little bit more movement in that bass sound. Now let's turn our attention to the dark energy module. First thing I want to do is separate the notes from each other. With this button over here, you can enable the internal VCA of the module. Every time the module detects that the voltage on its input changes, it will trigger that internal VCA, but it's a bit short right now, but we can change that with this knob. There is a lot of soundscaping that you can do with this module. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the module has a left oscillator and a right oscillator, each with its own output, and a main output which mixes the two. There is also an option to put an oscillator in LFO mode. If you press this button twice, you see the yellow low button light up, and I'm gonna make it even slower by moving it down 2 octaves. Now if we open up the cross modulation on the right oscillator, you'll hear how that LFO slowly influences the sound of the left oscillator. We'll also add some self-modulation on the right oscillator. Now the trick in this module is to use small values. If I open up this cross modulation so that the left oscillator influences the right one, it gets very harsh and even moves into noise territory. So small values. A little bit of cross modulation and some self-modulation. There are also some modulation inputs on the module, like this one, which will influence the length of the notes in the internal VCA. If I connect that to one of the outputs of Oct, you'll hear that the notes get shorter as the voltage moves down, but they end up becoming too short for my liking, so we'll have to limit that voltage input. For this I'll add the 1F module by Instruo, which is a crossfader module, but if I only connect one input signal to it, it will crossfade between that and 0, so it's actually attenuating the signal. I'll let it output only a quarter of the incoming signal, and now the notes slowly get longer and shorter over time. There are 2 more modulation inputs over here with CV knobs. If you press this button until both of the LEDs light up, the CV knobs are now linked to the modulation inputs. And if we take 2 more outputs from Ochd, we can now vary the cross modulation and the self-modulation that are applied by the module. If you want more details of how self-modulation, cross-modulation and external modulation inputs of the dark energy works, I highly recommend checking out the manual for this module that you can find on the Geodesics website. Soundscaping wise, I think this is sufficient, but I am going to add an additional effect into the mix. I'll use the Prince of Perception by Flag Audio for some delay. Connect it with the dark energy output. Set the volume of the third channel on the mixer a bit lower and connect the delay to it. Since the output of the dark energy module is already going directly into the mixer, I'll let the Prince of Perception output only the delay by setting the mix to 1. For the delay time, if we want it to be in sync with the 90 BPM, it should be set to 60 divided by 90, so 0.666 seconds. But I like the delay to be in more of an offbeat, so I'm going to set it to half a second or 120 BPM. Let's also add some reverb on those delays, and it gives us an additional layer on top of those arpeggiated chords. I'm also going to connect the panning of the delay to an LFO output of the Ochd, so that the delay moves from left to right in the mix. Now let's also modulate this feedback setting. If you set that to 0, the delay doesn't repeat that often. And all the way on 1, it repeats a lot, so everything blends into each other. Let's set that to a little above half, and use an Ochd output to modulate it. Open up the CV to half, and then we get more and less repeats in the delay. There is also a filter available in the module. If you close down the DJ width, you see that it will filter out the highs and the lows a bit, and you can move that filter up and down with the DJ center. Let's move the center to the left to filter out the highs a bit more. Again, take an Ochd output and let it move that center around. We'll close down the width. And now there's some more movement going on in that delay. Now I'm going to go back to the notes that are being played. Right now it is consistently playing the notes that are in the active chords, but I want it to play something else every now and again. For this I'm going to add the Fate module by Geodesics. And in order to get randomization, we provide it with a trigger on its trigger inputs, and every time the module receives a trigger, it will decide whether it will change the input value or not, depending on this free will knob. All the way at 0, the module will never change the input signal, and all the way at 1, it will always change the input signal. And how it modifies that signal is determined by the choices that knob. If you turn that to the left, it will add random voltage to the left side and remove it from the right side. But I'm gonna turn the knob to the right, where it will at random add or remove a voltage from both left and right side. So let's connect the switch output to the Fate input and the Fate output back into dark energy. Now we'll give the module a little bit of free will and increase the choices depth, which will cause a note to be changed every now and again. But as you can hear, since this is a random voltage change, these notes sound out of tune. But we can fix that, of course. Add in a quantizer by VCV, set it to the C major scale, and send the signal through it. Now those random notes are back in tune. But we can also influence the rhythm with the Fate module. If you provide it with a trigger at a higher rate, let's say double the current rate, then it will not only apply randomization when the chord notes change, but also every now and again in between two notes. So there's some additional randomization in there now, and combined with the Prince of Perception delay, I think that provides a very nice effect. One last item I want to do is go back to the chord sequence. You can see that it currently says sequence 1 over here, and if you turn this knob, it moves to sequence 2. So let's create a new chord sequence in here. Disable the attach so we can create changes, set it to 8 steps, and go from A to D, E, back to A, an E, G, D, and an F. And let's do the same on the third sequence. Length of 8, and go from A to E, G, A, F, D, G, and a C, which I'll set an octave higher, which will influence where the bass will play it. Now to switch between these sequences, there is a sequence number input. If I add a sample and hold module by Bogaudio, set that to a range between 0 and 3 volts, I happen to know that that will result in sequences 1 through 6, but there are only 3 sequences, so either I'll have to add 3 new sequences, or I go to the first sequence, in the right click menu choose portable sequence and then copy sequence, move to the fourth sequence, and paste the sequence. I'll do the same for the second sequence. Paste it in the fifth sequence. And then the third sequence. Into the sixth sequence. Click the attach again to show the currently playing note. And now I can connect the sample and hold output with the sequence number input. But I'll need a gate to trigger the sample and hold. And the clock outputs are all in use already. But 2 of those outputs are very close to each other, so I can use one of them to generate the other one. I'll add a 1 to 4 switch by VCV, trigger it with the 4 times clock, also use that clock as input. And now if I set the switch to 2 steps, that trigger is divided over the 2 outputs. We'll also need to connect the reset input, and now we can free up that middle clock output, and instead use the first output of the switch. If we now reset all the clock modules to sync them again, we get the same result as before, but with that clock output available. And I want that to trigger at the end of each chord sequence. So that's 4 beats times 8 steps, so it should be divided by 32, and we can use that as gate input on the sample and hold to change its random value at the end of a chord loop. I still need to trigger a new clock reset to sync everything with that divided by 32 clock. And if we now wait for the chord sequence to loop, you'll see that the output of the sample and hold changes every time the sequencer loops. And since it is random, it will sometimes start the same sequence again, and other times start a different one. And with that, the voice is now complete. I constructed it specifically for creating a tutorial with it, but once it was built, I liked the result so much that I decided to use it as basis for a full patch. I added some additional randomization to it, played around with the settings a bit and changed its sound a little, and then added some additional voices to complement it. This resulted in the Renard track that I released earlier. So if you're interested in seeing an evolution of this voice, go check out that video. And as always, happy patching!